Welcome to Coffee and Conversation. My name is Honorine, and today I'm with Sean, who is pursuing a PhD in clinical psychology. Sean, thank you for being with me today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with a little introduction from you.
Throughout undergrad, I mostly focused on social psychology and neuroscience, worked in a few different labs there, and actually had never taken an abnormal psychology class before applying for clinical psych programs, but I really was drawn toward clinical psychology more than toward other fields. And I applied primarily, but not only, to suicide research labs. And I was really excited when I got an interview request from Thomas Joyner here at FSU to work in his research lab focusing on suicide. I interviewed here, loved it immediately, and ultimately decided to come here. And so here I am. I'm a fifth-year student here. My primary research focuses are suicide broadly, and also measurement, how to measure, classify, and operationally define different constructs or variables.
So what do you study exactly in suicidal thoughts and prevention? Do you look at a specific population or specific maybe age range? Because I mean, to me, it sounds so big. So in a dissertation, people always say you can't study everything for your dissertation. So if you had to be more like specific about your topic, what would you say?
Sure. So for my dissertation, which I defended the prospectus for, that's a meta-analysis on meaning in life as it relates to different suicidal constructs. So there's this idea that floats around, philosophers talk about it, artists talk about it, certainly scientists talk about it, that there is some sort of connection between meaning in life and different suicidal outcomes, by which I mean suicidal ideation, thoughts and urges, suicide attempts, and suicide risk is kind of like a catch-all outcome. And there is some mixed research literature. Most of the published literature indicates that there is, in fact, an association between meaning in life and these different suicidal outcomes, but there are non-significant findings, so findings that indicate that there's no clear association between meaning in life and some sort of suicidal outcome. And there are even some instances of negative associations. Also, knowing how biased the published literature can be, my dissertation is on what's called a meta-analysis. So just an analysis of analyses, very meta. And it takes all of the published literature, all of the published analyses that exist, as well as published data that have not yet been analyzed, as well as currently unpublished data, by reaching out to people who study these things, seeing if they have data sets that they gathered, but then didn't get around to analyzing, or didn't get around to trying to publish, or tried to publish but couldn't publish and eventually gave up on it. And trying to see, okay, when we gather all of this research literature together, what do we end up seeing in terms of the association between meaning in life and each of these different suicidal outcomes? And are those associations different across, for example, people who have different racial or ethnic identities, people who have different gender identities, people who are in different countries, and thus we could use country as a sort of proxy for, broadly speaking, different cultures. And so that's my dissertation project. It's not the only thing I focus on with regard to suicide. I have fairly broad interests, and I would put them into two categories. One would be this sort of meaning in life territory. How does meaning and alignment with meaning and purpose relate to not just suicide, but psychopathology in general? And the other would be a focus on proper classification, definition, and measurement. If we're not measuring things, if we're not operationally defining things well, it'll be pretty hard to develop a good measurement for a given construct. And we want to make sure that our definitions correspond to our measures, and that our definitions are covering as much conceptual territory as we can without undue overlap, so that we can get fine-tuned, precise understandings of the constructs that we're trying to measure. And we can't really do valid, reliable research unless we have a good measure of a clearly operationally defined construct. And so that's a maybe even the more primary area of my research, where I want to make sure that we have good measurements for these things.
When you were talking about applying to grad school, you said that you were looking into suicidal research lab. So suicidal was always your main research interest. Where does this interest come from?
There's not a lot that I'm not or couldn't be interested in. I had to decide at some point that I can't do everything. And so I need to focus on something. And it seemed to me that there were a few somethings that were particularly challenging and particularly important to address. And that I had the motivation and interest and perhaps capacity to address. And so I wanted to throw myself at those things. And so suicide kind of got sifted out as the thing that I wanted to focus on in that regard. It's not that in undergrad I was especially focused on suicide and not on other topics. I just thought, well, I can, speaking of targeting resources, I can only target my resources at a very narrow set of things over the course of my 60 to 100 years of life. And so I will target, I have to decide, I have to collapse the potential that I have into something more concrete. And so I'll do it this way. I felt that I had the capacity to interact with people who were having very challenging feelings and thoughts, and that I would be able to handle those situations well, that I had the, let's say, temperament to do that. And still being an amateur, still being a trainee, I guess 5 years into doing clinical work. So far, that seems to be the case. I feel like I have that temperament to keep doing it. And so, yeah.
And what do you have in mind for the future? Do you want to stay focused on the research aspects? Do you want to, be with people more and use the research to help people, or do you want to do both?
I am interested in everything. There's nothing that I'm not interested in, and well, that's an overly broad statement. Most academic things are of interest to me. In my ideal dream world, I would focus on teaching and mentoring students, specifically undergraduate students, graduate students too, and I would use that teaching and mentoring role as an opportunity to help develop those students in concrete ways, where the end product of the teaching is that they have concrete materials, that they develop themselves into the sorts of people who can more easily who have set themselves up to more easily accomplish what they want to accomplish, to align themselves well and do what they want to do. And to teach things on topics like research methods and statistics and critical thinking with regard to these topics that I think I could provide information on that would be useful to students, and to use research as simultaneously an opportunity to develop research, but also an opportunity to teach and to help develop the next generation of researchers who are going to be coming after me. So that's my primary interest. I'm also interested in research for its own sake. I don't see a world in which I'm not doing some amount of research, but I'd like for that research to be completely intertwined with the teaching of students, especially undergraduate students, about how the research process works, how they can do good science, what it means to do good science, what the purpose of this whole scientific project is, and how they can most efficiently and in as streamlined of a way as possible carry out good science.
In between all those workshop, mentoring, clinicals, research, dissertation writing, where do you find time for yourself?
Well, I like all these things, so that's time for myself. I just intrinsically enjoy all of this. The only other things I really do in life are I write a lot. I like to go on long walks, like pina coladas and long walks on the beach.
So when you say you write, is it more like writing as a writer, where you think about maybe writing a book one day, or it's more writing as in a journal, like stream of thoughts where you just write down everything that's in your mind?
Outside of my academic writing and emails, most of what I write is essays, and that's very fun for me. And I also write a lot of poetry. I've tried writing short stories and novels, and I'm not very good at writing short stories or novels. So mostly essays and poems.
And you also spend time working on your value, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And what are those values for you?
I try very hard and regularly fail to align myself as well as I can with virtue and
Virtue.
well, it's value, same thing. Call it value, call it virtue, whatever. And so I try to identify what the virtues are, and then to align myself as well as I can with them, and to notice when I am miscalibrated, when I'm not aligning myself with virtue as well as I could. And this is just my own personal school of thought. I don't know how right it is. It's not something that I'm going around telling people like this is the only way to be. But for me personally, I've developed this mentality where I can kind of summarize it pretty quickly, which is the virtues are those things that objectively most optimally lead to whatever the most important objective metrics for determining human success are. I don't know what those are. I speculate on it sometimes, but I don't know. But let's use the term eudaimonia as a filler for that which is objectively most valuable for humans to achieve. And then the virtues are those things that if we just practice them, they align us with that. And so rather than muddling myself with any sort of utilitarian calculus, I don't worry about that, because anytime people try to engage in a utilitarian calculus and say, okay, what should I do to have to achieve the best outcomes for the most number of people? It's like, well, first of all, you still have the problem of determining what the best outcomes are, and second of all, it's like over what duration. And I'm sure you remember in undergrad or maybe nowadays getting into conversations like, well, this horrible thing happened, but had we stopped it from happening, maybe worse things would have happened. And something that people achieved that had really good impacts on people over the next 10 years, well, maybe the subsequent 10 years it had really negative impacts, or maybe you don't see it for 500 years, and then 500 years down the line, there are negative impacts. Rather than bog myself down with that, I try my best to identify those things that over any given duration, for any given population, lead on average to the best possible outcomes. And I try to align myself with those things. And I really think that that's been really effective for me. The more I've attempted to do that, the better my life has gotten. So I just try to, I don't try to embody the virtue necessarily, just to know that I'm headed in the right direction of it. And that seems to make the difference. Strip away all the fancy words that I'm saying. Basically what I'm trying to say is I'm trying my best to be a decent human being.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this fascinating interview talking about virtues and research. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on here.